Hey everyone, it's Dr. Ramani. Welcome back to this YouTube channel on narcissism, narcissistic relationships, healing from these relationships, and also cultural trends that seem to be related to narcissism. So let's talk about trad wives. What happens if a so-called trad wife gets into a relationship with a narcissist? So I'm older, so when I read these terms, I kind of chuckle a bit, but apparently a trad wife, as many of you know, is a modern term for a not modern role. These are people who hold on to traditional gender roles in marriages. These are heterosexual marriages in which the woman stops working outside the house for paid employment and instead focuses on caring for the home, making a sumptuous home, preparing meals, sometimes maintaining a garden, and caring for children, and caring for the husband. And the man, the husband, works and pays for it all. Though the irony is not lost on me that some trad wives are content creators, and that is a job, but I'm splitting hairs. Listen, as far as I'm concerned, for a trad wife, it's their choice, and if it works for them and they don't judge people for making different choices and they're happy and everyone's thriving, then great, good for them. I am not going to get into a sociological analysis of feminism and economics and societal expectations. I mean, some of this is frankly about choice, and if this is indeed an authentic choice for these women, then that's that. I'm going to leave it at that, okay? But, there's always a but. I read an article somewhere about, basically it was a person, I think, giving a first-person accounting of sort of a trad wife situation gone bad. The woman was in one of these trad wife setups and described her husband as controlling and entitled, and you know the rest of that story, and that made me stop and wonder. We hear all these wonderful positive stories about trad wives and how sort of breezy and gauzy their lives are, but what happens when a trad wife marries a narcissist? Now listen, folks, a trad wife is not something new. I grew up in the 60s and 70s in an era in which women were just beginning to have more consistent options out of required trad wifing. But women were still only slowly entering the workplace outside of the home. Lots of mothers were still home with their children. Divorce laws were still tricky. But when I was a kid, I would say around 10 years before I was born, trad wives were pretty much all wives. Giving it a modern name doesn't make it something new. And back then, there were women, a goodly chunk of women, who were in narcissistic relationships. It was not pretty for them then or now, and that's not what it was called then, right? In some cases, these were called difficult marriages or unhappy marriages or simply just marriages, and many times the wives were blamed. The bigger movements in recognizing domestic violence wouldn't happen until the 1970s. So that means that in that entire era, pre the 1970s, a woman in a narcissistic relationship was effectively trapped and unhappy and forlorn with few options. And in essence, living their lives as a sacrifice to controlling and invalidating spouses. The Stepford Wives was written in 1972. And it's basically a book about organized narcissistic relationships and the loss of identity that comes from that in one fictional town. The challenge a trad wife would have if she had a narcissistic husband is having few options, even in a modern age where women do have more options. And then had that awakening upon recognizing her husband as narcissistic, that cooking and cleaning and child rearing for a person who is contemptuous, invalidating, controlling, and betraying doesn't feel good. But the ideology of trad wifehood could result in its own form of betrayal blindness, right? And an unwillingness to question what's happening in the marriage. And perhaps a trad wife in that situation would question herself more. The self-blame could be worse. Well, maybe I'm not being a good enough wife. A trad wife may lack financial autonomy, which would make leaving very difficult. She may have been out of the paid employment space for a long while, which could make wage earning difficult. But ultimately, this whole trad wife thing, I gotta say, it's definitely not for me. If both people are consenting and content, then fine. But if it is in essence one person, the wife, solely in the service of the husband to make his life easier, but her not feeling emotionally or in any other way supported other than maybe financially, then that doesn't work without there being some cult level denial or dissociation. And even if those things are happening, they don't happen without a cost. Being in a narcissistic relationship, whether you recognize it's narcissistic or not, means anxiety, physical health issues, and a whole host of other psychological issues. Trad wifehood is not predicated on power imbalances if both parties are clear what they're getting into. But it does raise for me the specter of whether people really do understand, even in 2024, what they're getting into when they actually get legally married, intermingle finances, what community property means, how family court works. Narcissism or no narcissism, lots of people are entering into one hell of a complex legal contract involving lifelong earnings and focusing on the frosting flavor of a cake instead of exactly what they're agreeing to in front of all those folks in their pretty dresses and suits. For many folks, it works out fine, which is great, but nobody really ever shows you a fine print version of the contract of marriage. Instead, you just sign a form down at some city hall and that's it. A rental car contract has more detail. And if you are marrying a narcissistic person, it can get very tricky because frankly, I am quite surprised at how often the narcissistic person in a marriage themselves doesn't understand the fine print of marriage and subsequently can become quite vindictive when they realize that little piece of paper they signed meant that they might have to hand over money and they don't want to. All of that to say, if a person is going to slide into a marital or other long-term committed relationship agreement that involves taking a role that puts them in doing for another person, you better be sure that person in that relationship has empathy, patience, compassion, respect, and self-awareness. Under those circumstances, you can be a trad wife, a mod wife, a retro wife, a postmodern wife. It doesn't matter. But however you do it, if it's a marriage to a narcissistic person, the trad wife thing can go really badly much more quickly than in a marriage in which both spouses may have outside employment or other roles that will be protective against the one-sidedness of the narcissistic relationship, at least financially. Listen, people need to do what works for them, but this particular trad wife relationship construction clearly can be very problematic when narcissism comes on the scene. And frankly, maybe this isn't the right conversation, and maybe it's not about trad wives or stay-at-home dads or any roles in relationships that are either strict or modern or evolving, but rather the conversation is about two people being in a relationship, and it really only works if those people are able to hold space for the separate reality of the other with empathy and respect and equity and psychological safety. In the absence of those things, it doesn't matter what roles we're talking about, trad wife or otherwise. Without that stuff, it simply isn't going to work. Hope that helps, and thanks again.